The honourable member from Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am grateful for the opportunity to rise and speak today to the Ways and Means motion, budgetary policy. More specifically, I appreciate this opportunity to comment publicly on yet another awful budget tabled in this place by the Liberals, which shows just how out of touch they really are. We've had 9 years of deficit budgets, which have led us to the mess Canadians are facing today. Budget 2024 also shows that this Prime Minister has learned nothing from his mistakes over those past 9 years. He continues to push inflationary deficits, which drive up interest rates and make life more expensive for Canadians. By continuing to add to his massive debt, he is endangering jobs and social programs like healthcare and education. In fact, after 9 years of disastrous governance, Canada will now be spending more on its debt than on healthcare for Canadians. The failures of this Liberal government are clear in this budget. They pushed off issues, kicking the can down the road, and now those issues have come home to roost. Housing, crime, immigration, inflation, to name just a few, are the issues created by this government. These issues did not materialize overnight. They were well known to this government years ago, yet they stuck their heads in the sand, content to spend more and more money on their pointless policies to support their divisive and destructive ideology. Now that these issues have become full-blown crises, they've conceded that there may be a problem. But rather than address the problem, they've decided to repackage their old policies in an attempt to fool Canadians into believing that they are taking action. It is hard to know whether they are simply overestimating the positive impact of their policies or are completely disingenuous in their intent. One of their plans in this budget to repurpose federal properties to provide thousands of homes has come up short. As reported by Blacklock's, the government has found less than 400 vacant federal properties, many of which cannot be used for housing. Some of these properties include Parks Canada parking lots, a former National Defence firing range, and an empty lot near a remote Coast Guard lighthouse. The review of federal lands has been a promise of this Liberal government since 2015. In that election, their platform stated, and I quote, "We will conduct an inventory of all available federal lands and buildings that could be repurposed and make some of these lands available at low cost for affordable housing in communities where there is a pressing need," unquote. Now in 2024, after they have created a housing crisis, they've decided to go ahead and finally start the review. Their budget states, the federal government is conducting a rapid review of its entire federal lands portfolio to identify more land for housing. Perhaps I should have included the definition of rapid here in my speech. They're hoping that Canadians have forgotten that this is a 9-year-old promise that they are attempting to repackage as a new initiative. Putting aside the fact that this is an old promise in a new package, this measure is not a solution to the housing crisis. This Prime Minister is asking Canadians to believe that he will build thousands of houses in old parking lots and firing ranges. This is a sign of desperation. He wants Canadians to believe that after 9 years of ignoring the problem or introducing policies that have made the problem worse, he will now make the housing market fairer. He is the one who stole the dream of home ownership from a generation. He is the one who broke the system. Now, after breaking everything, he wants Canadians to believe that he will somehow find the capacity to magically fix it all. But he's had more than enough chances, Mr. Speaker. Chances to make life more affordable, which he has failed to do at every opportunity. Conservatives gave him a chance to cut taxes or to avoid raising taxes on all Canadians, but he carried on his plan and raised the carbon tax. He also continues in his efforts to gut and block Bill C-234, which would take the carbon tax off for farmers. And he continues to ramp up spending in the hopes that Canadians will not see it for the pitiful attempt at buying votes that it is. But Canadians are not fooled and are fed up with the irresponsible spending of this NDP Liberal coalition that is driving inflation. Instead of using this budget to demonstrate that they understand the effect their disastrous policies have had on Canadians, they are doubling down on those same failed policies. Adding $40 billion in new spending will only add more fuel to the inflationary fire. The repeated promises from this government for fiscal restraint have gone by the wayside as they continue to spend unsustainably, trading away Canadians' futures for their own short-term political gain. Like many of my colleagues, I had the opportunity this past week to speak with constituents. Three main themes were raised following this budget. The first concern I heard, I have already outlined in my speech: deficits and overspending. The cost of government has skyrocketed under this NDP Liberal coalition while they spend on their pet projects. This is going to have serious repercussions for our children and grandchildren's futures. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost for any generation. I also heard about the wasteful spending. Many are watching what is happening in parliamentary committees, and more specifically, the Government Operations and Estimates Committee, of which I am a member. Canadians are shocked at the massive outsourcing contracts for Liberal insiders and the historic levels of corruption being uncovered by Conservatives, all while the NDP Liberal government tries to cover it up. Favoritism by this government is rampant, with their funneling of tens of millions of dollars to Liberal insiders and their companies. This is particularly insulting to Canadians, as they are struggling with a cost of living crisis created by this Prime Minister. But while Canadians are asking for too much, it is clear his friends can never get enough. Finally, a major concern brought up to me is this government's underlying commitment to the carbon tax, a tax which does nothing for the environment but adds to the cost of everything. As we enter spring, my constituents are seeing the full cost of the carbon tax across a winter on the prairies. The carbon tax drives up the cost of gas and home heating, which are vital for Canadians living in rural Canada. These increased costs also extend to food and other goods, which businesses pass on to the consumer. This passing on of the cost of the carbon tax from businesses to consumers is a simple idea to understand, but it seems only those outside of the government benches can wrap their heads around it. These added costs are putting more pressure on Canadians who are struggling with the Liberals' cost of living crisis, and this budget does nothing to alleviate that pressure. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, it will come as no surprise that I cannot support this budget. It is more of the same failed policies from this NDP Liberal coalition, which refuses to acknowledge its failures. Instead of having the humility to acknowledge their shortcomings, after 9 years, they refuse to take any responsibility and continue to blame everyone else except themselves. Canadians are suffering, and this government is refusing to help them. Conservatives will bring common sense back to government after the next election, and that next election cannot come soon enough for Canadians. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Deputy House Leader.
On the topic of acknowledging shortcomings, would the member agree that the Leader of the Opposition should not be hanging out with Diagolon?
The Honourable Member for Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, as we debate this budget, we are seeing the results of this government's disastrous spending addiction. After 9 years of this government, as I've said, we've had 9 deficit budgets, and Canadians are struggling, and this government has no solutions. That member and his party should start listening to Canadians to understand what they need. Thank you.
Question commentaire.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Lac Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, thank you. It's almost the same, but I appreciate the speech from my colleague. We don't always agree on everything, but we were told that the Conservatives would be a decentralizing party. But when it had the opportunity to prove it, they voted against an amendment that just asked this House to respect the Canadian Constitution, Mr. Speaker. The Bloc Québécois asked that jurisdictions be respected. But the Conservative Party voted against this amendment. My question is very simple, Mr. Speaker. Why did they vote against an amendment from the Bloc Québécois that just asked that the Canadian Constitution be respected?
Carleton, Eagle Creek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the question from my colleague. Conservatives do believe that the federal government should respect the jurisdiction of provinces. What we have seen from this current government is repeated attempts to override provincial jurisdiction. We know that Canadians deserve a government does not overextend themselves in an attempt to micromanage their lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I like the honourable member, but of course she lived through the dismal decade, as all Canadians did, of the Harper government, where the fiscal management was basically thrown out the window. $116 billion in liquidity supports for the banking sector to prop up their profits. $30 billion a year, according to the PBO. $30 billion a year given to overseas tax havens because of the notorious Harper tax haven treaties that basically eliminated the fiscal capacity of the federal government. That's $300 billion over a decade. I mean, the Conservatives have no lessons to give anybody in terms of fiscal management. They were terrible. But I wanted to ask my colleague a very simple question about pharmacare. There's 17,000 people in her riding that have diabetes, that are paying up to $1,000 a month for medication. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you know, the risk of stroke or heart attack or death is 4 times greater for people with diabetes than for other Canadians. And yet Conservatives are blocking at every single step the pharmacare supports that would mean a difference of up to $1,000 a month in supports for people in her riding, 17,000 in her riding. And my simple question is, why are the Conservatives blocking this life-saving medication that would make such a difference in the lives of her constituents?
Here. Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank my honourable colleague for the question. But I will simply say this. The NDP, in my estimation, have sold their souls in the desperation for power. They have abandoned their constituents for the vanity of their leader. The NDP have a big decision to make when the time comes to vote on this particular budget. Will they stand up for Canadians and be an opposition party, finally holding this government to account for their abysmal record, or will they continue on with their coalition? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Caribou, Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask our honourable colleague if perhaps she could tell the House and tell Canadians, and hopefully those on the other side that might be listening, chances are after 9 years they still are not listening, but just the pain that her constituents are going through because of the insane policies that this government has levied against hardworking Canadians in her riding. Thank you.
The honourable member for Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek, with a quick answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to perhaps repeat some of the things that I noted in my speech. As I said today, we are seeing the results of this government's disastrous spending addiction, and after 9 years of this Liberal government and 9 deficit budgets, Canadians are struggling, and this government has no solutions. We see millions of Canadians going to food banks, housing costs have doubled, rent has doubled, and Canadians are desperate for change. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.